Good afternoon. My name is Maya Berry. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab American Institute. We are a Washington-based institution that was established in 1985, specifically to deal with the civic engagement of Arab Americans. There are 3.7 million of us in this country, and we are engaged in all facets of civil society. One of the things that we have worked on in a post-9/11 environment is trying very hard to strike a better balance between our national security and our civil liberties. We say this often in some ways. We're your canary in a coal mine. If there are issues that are impacting us, I trust that you will be concerned because they eventually will find their way to impacting all of you as well. We wanted to do this conversation specifically at the Democratic National Convention. As we do each 4 years when we convene these meetings, we bring together both delegates as well as friends and supporters in the local communities to have important policy conversations. So we're opening up today with this conversation on civil liberties, and then this afternoon, if you want to stay with us, we're going to be continuing the conversation on Palestine. Though with our conversation today, we'll be talking a bit about the domestic implications of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict because they've managed to percolate into First Amendment issues as well. So what I'm going to do is simply introduce our panelists all at once and provide the frame quickly, and then have our presenters give their talk, and then we really welcome the opportunity for questions and answers from all of you. Sorry about that. Questions and answers from all of you. To my immediate left is Vincent Warren, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He oversees CCR's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work, which includes using international and domestic law to hold corporations and government officials accountable. Vince can speak to so many of the issues that we're talking about today, but one of the most important roles that CCR has played in terms of the issues I've highlighted today is the work that they've done actually creating Palestine Legal, having it sort of spin off and do the work that they're doing on that. So Vince will be able to touch on a variety of the issues we're talking about, but also provide some guidance on that. Next is Michael Herman, who is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security Program. His work focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. He's a 16-year veteran of the FBI. Mike spent 16 years, as I said, working there, including infiltrating white supremacist movements. So his insight on the national security piece has really been incredibly helpful, particularly in the frame of this new narrative we now are engaged in with regards to countering violent extremism. So Mike will be able to provide a lot of insight on that. And finally, but not last, is Susan Herman, who is the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She teaches at Brooklyn Law School, where she holds a chair as the Sentinel Professor of Law. She writes extensively on constitutional criminal procedures, and it goes without saying, the work that the ACLU has done on these issues has been profoundly important for all of us, so we're delighted to have you all with us today. I want to just start, before turning it over to you, Susan. This election cycle has produced a lot of issues for us in a variety of ways. The conversation on civil liberties hasn't been, in my opinion, as part of the process as it should be. Primarily because I think in an election cycle, both parties work and pivot away from this idea that they're going to be weak on national security. There's this false dichotomy that if you care about civil liberties issues, then you're positioned as weak on national security. Can you start it sort of to frame your comments with that piece?
Okay, well, I have to start with the ACLU is nonpartisan, so of course we neither support nor oppose any candidate, trying as that might be sometimes. What we have recently done, and if people are interested, what we do, we don't support or oppose people, but we just recently issued a report on Mr. Trump's policy proposals, because, you know, your mother used to say, I love you, it's just your behavior I don't like. So we think it's perfectly fair for us to comment on the proposals that Mr. Trump has been making about excluding all the Muslims and building walls and, you know, these really extreme measures that have been proposed. We would hope that after reading our report about the 16 different ways in which his proposals are unconstitutional, that he might change his mind. So, you know, it's a conversation that we have started in that way. We will also, because we are nonpartisan, also be issuing a report very shortly on Hillary Clinton and the civil liberties ramifications of her proposals. Yeah, I think national security is a very difficult issue, and I think it's really interesting to be talking about this in the context of this panel here today. Because what you hear from a lot of Americans ever since 9/11 is you hear people say, well, don't we have to give up a little liberty in order to be safe? And that's the kind of trope that goes around a lot, you know, as if giving up liberty is going to make us safe. Now, I think that there's a tremendous problem with whether the things that we've done that give up liberties in fact make us safer. But one of the things that I think we need to be talking about today, and that I think really should be a very important issue at this convention, is whether it's a little too easy for people to talk about giving up other people's rights. So a lot of the kinds of things that I want to talk about, you know, my job was to talk about surveillance and all the watch lists and so forth. So, you know, for most of us, what the watch lists and the terrorist screening have meant is sometimes we have to take off our shoes at the airport. But what it's meant for Muslims and Arabs around the country is, you know, humiliation. You know, people, I'll tell you about how people have been essentially banished from the country. You know, people have been prosecuted, detained. And so I think that it's a dimension that is often missing from the national security debate when people try to frame the issue as liberty versus safety. I think it's a false question. I don't think we're getting safety at all from what we're doing. But there's also an equality dimension here about, you know, whose rights are being sacrificed and whose aren't, that I think is a critical part that should be part of the convention debate.
Thank you, Susan. Can you say a bit about the watch list piece? In the most recent attack, this came up. I'm sorry, okay. No problem at all. I never ever have a problem being loud, and apparently today
Don't feel you have to look at us while you're talking to us. I think that means
that's
the
fine.
problem. We know
Okay.
you're
Got it. Got it. In terms of the most recent attack, the question of the Second Amendment rights really surfacing, particularly among members of Congress, also produced an interesting conversation, a vehicle to have the conversation about the watch list and other amendments that we ought to be concerned about. Speak a bit to that as well.
Okay, I actually wrote down the quote from Paul Ryan because I think this is just astonishing, and it really kind of exposes this failure of empathy that we've been having. What Paul Ryan says, I'm sure you all know that after a lot of the incidents that involved mass killings with guns, one of the proposals that's still alive in the House of Representatives in particular is to prohibit anyone who is on a terrorist watch list from owning a gun. It's like, isn't that a no-brainer? If they're a suspected terrorist, of course they shouldn't be able to own a gun. Isn't that a good place to start with gun control? Well, the ACLU's position is, no, it isn't. And our position for years is that these watch lists are really not worth very much. They're compiled in secret on the basis of who knows what kind of evidence, who knows how unreliable it is. There is no sort of due process involved. They don't tell you, why you might be on a watch list or what the quality of evidence was. And let me tell you one story since we're in Pennsylvania. Reggie Schufert, who's the director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania, is here. And one case that the ACLU of Pennsylvania won, I think it's a really interesting example, so instead of just talking abstractions. So Eric Sherfin was a veteran of the Gulf War, and while he was over in the Gulf War, he was a pilot, and he got some training about Islam and became very intrigued. So when he came back home, he studied Islam and decided to convert and married an absolutely wonderful woman named Rubina Tureen, who is a Muslim and is now on the ACLU of Pennsylvania board because of the incident I'm about to describe to you. So after Eric left the service, he became he had been a helicopter pilot there, and he became a commercial pilot delivering things. And one day his employer said to him, Eric, we're going to have to fire you if you can't get yourself off of the no-fly list. It's a real problem. Every time you go to an airport, they try to stop you. They don't want you to be flying the commercial planes, and we really can't have a pilot for whom this is happening. So Eric went to the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and they brought a lawsuit on his behalf. And as part of the lawsuit, this is the kind of thing that he never would have found out otherwise, but he found out how he had come to be put onto the watch list. And what had happened was that one of his acquaintances, knowing that he was a Muslim, had reported to the FBI that Eric had been retrofitting his car to carry bombs. Now, what this was based on was Eric had a broken seat in the back seat of his car, which he removed. Okay, and somebody, knowing he was a Muslim, jumped to that conclusion. The FBI accepted that evidence. We don't know, what else they might have thought, and he ended up on this watch list. I actually wrote a book on the impact of all this on ordinary people and how all these dragnets really sweep in a lot of unintended people. But I quote in the book what I think is absolutely Kafkaesque. What the government was doing at the time was they wouldn't tell you whether you were on the no-fly list or not. So after Eric complained that he couldn't understand why he should be on the no-fly list and he needed to keep his job, the government sends him back a letter saying, we have received your complaint and we've investigated, and if there was anything wrong, and if you were on the no-fly list, and if there needed to be a correction, we made it. It's pure Kafka, right? So I think I also need to follow this up with a more recent lawsuit. We won the lawsuit for Eric. He kept his job, and so happy ending there for him. There was another lawsuit that we started in 2010 on behalf of 10 American citizens and permanent residents, including 4 veterans who found themselves on the no-fly list and were unable to come home to the United States. They were stranded out of the country because they were not allowed to get on a plane, had no idea why or whether they were in fact on a no-fly list. One of those people, our named plaintiff, Herman Latif, the case is now called Latif versus Lynch. Herman Latif was a disabled Marine veteran, and he and his wife were visiting some family in Egypt because they had a baby who they wanted to introduce to the relatives. And when they went to fly home, he was told he was not allowed to get on the plane. So he was stranded in Egypt. Because he was disabled, he was getting disability payments from the VA, and he was required to go periodically for examinations at the VA in Virginia so that they could determine that he was still disabled. So what this also put at risk was whether or not he was going to get his disability payments. And this happened to a lot of people. So we brought the lawsuit in 2010, and in 2014, a district judge ruled that the no-fly list procedure and redress procedure was unconstitutional, and held that people do have a right to find out whether or not they're on the no-fly list, and maybe to find out, why, so that they could begin to challenge the evidence. So the Obama administration agreed to tell people whether or not they're on the no-fly list, and possibly to give them some evidence. The clients in that case got summaries of the evidence. Here are some things, but not the whole picture. And we just regarded that as inadequate. So just last month, in this past June, was the most recent argument in Latif versus Lynch, where we're really challenging the no-fly list and the whole idea of having everything done in secret behind the curtain with shoddy evidence and no opportunity to challenge and find out what's wrong. Now, again, if you think about, Paul Ryan and the NRA all of a sudden jumping on board, oh, this is totally unfair. Here's my quote from Paul Ryan, which I wrote down because I just think it's so amazing. People have due process rights in this country, and we can't have some governmental official just arbitrarily put them on a list. Well, thank you, Mr. Ryan. We've been saying that since 2001. So I think there's a lot to be done there. The Obama administration has not been all that receptive. The worst abuses in my book, that I can maybe talk about some of the other ones later, happened during the Bush administration. The Obama administration has not done too much to really make this better in the watch list area. And the no-fly list is the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other watch lists, but I want to stop there.
Thank you, Susan. I want to just take it back a little sort of macro level piece, because part of the reason we're able to have the conversation we're having today is after 9/11, our government issued what were called profiling guidance. In 2003, Attorney General Ashcroft issued guidance that were designed to say that profiling is a bad thing and we ought not to do it. Within those guidance, they allowed for what was called the national security and border security loophole. In 2014, most recently, Attorney General Eric Holder, part of the legacy of Attorney General Eric Holder was that he would revise these guidelines to fix some of the abuses that we're talking about. Some of these very cases that are being cited sort of take place because profiling is allowed to take place. So the guidance was issued in 2014, the revisions, and while there were additional categories that were provided, additional protections that were afforded, the loopholes remain in place, allowing for national security, border security, and actually local law enforcement. What that means is everything that we're talking about is able to happen, partly because we have not actually resolved the issue of the Department of Justice guidance on profiling. So when we engage on these issues, I just want to frame it that way. I also want to note something that's very important. We've talked about the no-fly list. There's also a selectee list. We now have a better redress process, thanks in part to the lawsuits of the ACLU and others, on the no-fly list than we do on the redress list, the selectee list, which is actually a larger group, and the ability for one to challenge their position on that list is now not what it ought to be, and I think we'll continue to push on that. Shifting the conversation now to sort of this profiling lens and its specific impact broader than everyone else on Arab Americans and American Muslims, I want to turn to Mike German. Mike, we've had these conversations many times with you, because I think it's important that we talk about this developing securitized relationship that exists when it comes to Arab Americans and American Muslims. Much has been made, correctly so, of candidate Trump's Muslim ban. President Clinton yesterday at the Democratic National Convention on the floor, during his speech, said the following, and I just want to share it with you because I think it's connected directly to what we're talking about here. He said, "If you are a Muslim and you love America and freedom and you hate terror, stay here and help us win and make a future together. We want you." So while it was part of a speech that is about bringing us all together and making us feel good and responding in some ways directly to some of the things that have come out of the other party, it certainly cast American Muslims as separate than others. And it begs the question, where would you go as opposed to staying? There are lots of things that it conjures up for me, but I think it directly ties to this countering violent extremism narrative and the way that these programs are developing. So I'd love for you to share information on that.
Sure, thank you very much, Maya, and thanks to AAI for inviting me. I work for the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, which also is a nonpartisan organization, so make it clear that we don't support any particular candidate or party. And kind of coming off Susan's remarks, this programming around countering violent extremism had existed in a couple of different forms, but it's really the Obama administration that has developed and implemented it in a way that I believe is causing a lot of these problems, and particularly in the rhetoric around counterterrorism. So for those that have never heard of it, countering violent extremism is a counterterrorism strategy designed to move what they call left of boom, right? Trying to identify terrorists before they actually do harm, which is extremely laudable goal. We would all want that to happen, to be able to know before somebody commits an act of violence that they're going to do that. The problem with CVE is that it follows a flawed theory of who becomes a terrorist. And this is a theory that has been in existence for well over 100 years. It was used in the early 1900s to call labor organizers radicals, right? There was some anarchist violence going on. There were revolutions in Russia. There was a certain amount of political violence, and the idea was if these labor organizers are talking about workers' rights, and revolutionaries in Russia are conducting a revolution for workers' rights, it must be part of a grand conspiracy. And these must be the intellectual support for the people committing violence, and they must secretly support the violence even though they don't believe it's true. This concept of radicalization followed through J. Edgar Hoover's 50-year FBI career. Of course, it was used to suppress the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s as well. So CVE takes that same theory that people move from radical ideas to becoming violent and sets up the procedure as countering extremism, right? So the idea is that by suppressing the expression of what they consider extreme political, religious, or social concepts will somehow reduce the violence. I have a couple of problems with this. One is that the theory has been disproven through empirical studies for decades now. I mean, we have done plenty of studies of actual terrorists, and we know that they don't progress through the stages that the government professes, that they don't become radical and then become a terrorist, that many of the people who commit acts of violence, including terrorist violence, come out essentially without any previous adoption of any particular ideas or involvement with any particular social movements, much like the recent cases we've seen. So we've got this programming that's built on an unsound foundation. But then I'm also concerned with how it's actually applied, because everybody who promotes these programs will say Of course, there are all kinds of different violent extremists in the world. I, in my FBI career, worked undercover in white supremacist groups and anti-government militia groups. There are all these, but CVE is only directed towards Muslim communities, or at least predominantly directed towards Muslim communities. So the fact that the government takes this programming and doesn't address it to all extremists, but just Muslim communities, reinforces a lot of the Islamophobic themes, that this is a monolithic community, that it's somehow alien to the American social fabric, that it is the source of terrorism, or at least the most serious kind of terrorism, and that there is a collective responsibility for this violence that the community itself has to address, rather than law enforcement and intelligence. So it reinforces all these anti-Muslim, anti-Arab themes. Also in application, the advantage that the Obama administration has, they started rolling these programs out in 2011, is that they aren't new. This is actually a model that we're following that was started in Britain in 2005 after the 7/7 terrorist attacks there. And we have plenty of studies of how that program has worked, and virtually all of them say it has been entirely divisive, counterproductive of its goals of building community cohesiveness, and counterproductive to stopping violent extremism. So we know that this programming doesn't work in application, and yet the government is moving forward with these programs. Another part of the problem in application is how many programs there are. The Department of Justice started pilot programs in 3 cities, Boston, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles, that are led by the U.S. Attorney in those cities. The FBI has its own programming. The Department of Homeland Security has separate programming. So somebody impacted by one of these programs might not even know whose program it is. And when advocates like us argue with the people running these programs about concerns, some of them might narrow the program a little bit, make it a little less overtly spying. But you don't know that while the U.S. Attorney's program might be not involved in spying, the FBI is mirroring a program that is actually doing intelligence collection through these programming. So it's very difficult to have any kind of accountability when there are so many different actors in the field. And on top of that, they've now put out money from the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, actually hiring private companies and private entities to engage in this programming, where there's virtually no accountability or transparency in what they're doing. So it's highly problematic on many levels. The most recent one is the FBI's shared responsibility committees. And many of the FBI programs now are directed to K through 12 schools, which again follows a British model, and targeting school children and identifying the indicators of their vulnerability to terrorism by alienation and the expression of political grievances. So you can imagine in an academic environment that expressing a political grievance, identifying you and getting you reported to law enforcement will have a suppressive effect on the dialogue that we need to be having about our civil rights and the unity of all the different groups in our country to address serious concerns.
I also think it's important to highlight that in the post 9/11 environment, we saw the country come together in a very meaningful way, led in part by President Bush, who visited a mosque shortly thereafter. I think one of the things that's hard for us to deal with in the context of these programs is specifically that it actually sort of poses this community as a potential threat. And we've seen post-ISIS a real surge in hate crimes targeting American Muslims, Arab American institutions, threats, vandalism. So if you could speak a bit, Mike, to the way that, I always struggle in these conversations because who would be opposed to countering violent extremism, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to explain to people why this is something that's there. But the reality is, as you've laid out, there are very reasons to be concerned. Part of that is also the way that others view our communities.
That is a huge part of the problem, is that it's through government programming, setting this community apart as a particular security risk. And one of the major problems that we saw in Britain and we're seeing here in the United States is that there isn't a Muslim and Arab community in the United States, right? There are a lot of different Muslim and Arab communities in the United States, right? This is a very diverse community. It's diverse in belief, both by sect and it's diverse in race, it's diverse in economic situation. It's this incredibly, it's not at all the monolith this program would suggest it was. And by presenting it that way, it misidentifies what's actually going on and again presents them as somehow alien to the fabric of society. Where one of the big problems is once they are now providing money and access to government policymakers through these programs, there are a lot of groups that need the resources. There are a lot of groups who like the access to policymakers. So they want to participate in these programs. So the groups who are saying, wait a minute, you know, these programs do harm in our community, it divides the communities by, in one report it calls them the engagers and the disengagers. And I actually went to talk to the researchers to say, you know, the disengagers are not disengagers, right? They're actually actively opposing these programs. They're meeting with their government representatives. They're just in opposition to a program. That doesn't make them a disengager, but the idea is creating this good Muslim, bad Muslim imagery that anybody who supports the government programming is good and deserves government resources and access. Anyone who opposes a government policy is an outlier and should be ostracized. And that's where we have seen these programs actually do damage in communities, and particularly when you're describing political grievance as an indicator of dangerousness, you put all of us at risk who are fighting for civil rights, because by the very nature of our advocacy, we are identifying ourselves as potential problems.
If I could actually add to that, Mike was talking about the diversity of communities around the country. It's not just sort of one monolith. And the problem here in terms of the countering violence extremism idea is not only the federal government. The New York Police Department, I'm sure you heard, had its own version of what they called the report called Radicalization in the West. And they looked for the signs that somebody might be about to become a terrorist. Because the whole shift in thinking that we're talking about is post 9/11. We weren't just looking to punish people for things they had done or were doing, but we're trying to predict who might become a terrorist. And that's obviously a very dangerous thing to do, to predict who might become something in the future. So in the Radicalization in the West report, what they identified as the kind of the signs, the precursors that you might be about to become a terrorist were things like you had decided to grow a beard or abstain from alcohol. Now, in other words, what they were identifying with the precursors of being a terrorist were simply that you were, a Muslim, and just features of being a Muslim, which is obviously incredibly divisive. So we had a lot of things play out in New York around that, which maybe we'll talk about later in the New York example. But this is something that's been happening very much at the local level, and really does. What the New York Police Department was doing, infiltrating mosques and the surveillance, really not just divided communities, but tore the Muslim community apart, because there was so much chilling effect from all the spying and surveillance.
And in an example of how unscientific and circular a lot of these arguments are, for all of you with beards in the audience who now realize that you've demonstrated your dangerousness, another indicator of dangerousness was shaving a beard. So you can't win.
Right. Yeah, if you adopted a Muslim name or converted to Islam, that was suspicious, and it was also suspicious if you Americanized your name.
Right.
So what Mike is saying is so arbitrary. Paul Ryan was right about that.
Thank you to both of you for that. It is interesting when Senator Ted Cruz talked about patrolling, quote, Muslim neighborhoods, I was happy to find a bit of a pushback to say, well, what does that mean? I mean, what's a Muslim neighborhood? But we haven't successfully translated that sentiment to these particular programming. People don't see that as unusual as the idea that there is a Muslim neighborhood. Transitioning now, which is to Vince, in a way that I actually don't want to do, because I don't want to put this in the context of radical ideas, right? But the way that the conversation has been having around First Amendment issues, in some ways, really is positioning some views as radical and therefore should be suppressed. It is the reason that I encourage you to visit our website at aiusa.org. We actually have an issue brief entitled The Domestic Implications of the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. We look specifically at suppression of free speech issues tied to the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, as well as what's happening around Title VI issues on college campuses. So these have all come together in a sort of an odd way. We're grateful for having Vince with us here because the Center for Constitutional Rights has really been at the forefront of these issues for many, many years and is really taking up defending this particular threat that we're seeing now. So Vince, thank you for being with us. I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Maya. Hi, everybody. Hello, everybody. This is Democracy at Work. Thank you very much, Lenora. Lenora Lapidus from the ACLU. My name is Vince Warren. I'm very happy to be here, and very much like Mike and Susan said, I need to start off by saying that CCR is as well a nonpartisan organization and neither takes position in favor of or against any candidate. However, we are in a situation here in our country that is quite dire. It is not unprecedented, and I would like to actually just take a little bit of time just to give you a sense of who CCR is and how we play into this, to talk a little bit about the structures that we're seeing that I think were very ably talked about by Maya, Susan, and Mike, and then to talk about how that manifests with respect to First Amendment activity with respect to Palestine. CCR has been around for 50 years. This is our 50th anniversary. The Center for Constitutional Rights is known as CCR. There's another CCR that some of you of a certain age might know, the Creedence Clearwater Revival. Just want to point out that they're only 49 this year. But what we do is we litigate and advocate around some of the toughest issues, the most intractable issues around the country. And you can tell a little bit about what the mood of the country is and what are the civil liberties and civil rights issues by looking at who our clients are. So when we were founded in 1966, most of our clients were civil rights workers in Mississippi and in the South. In the early 1970s, most of our clients were women who were advocating for to have Medicaid and to have their abortions and reproductive freedom to be able to pay for, but that was being pushed back. In the 1980s, we were representing protesters and folks related to Central America. When you get to the post 9/11 period, most of our clients are Arab, Muslim, immigrants, or African American. So that tells you where we are. But in looking at the work that we've been privileged to do in the last 16 years, looking back over what's been happening, Center for Constitutional Rights was the first organization to file habeas corpus challenges for the men that were brought in Guantanamo. And at that time, most of us, those of us who are old enough to remember that time, felt that this was somehow aberrational, that this was a George Bush related plot, that somehow there was a rationality to keeping these dangerous, horrible men in a offshore prison and not bringing them to the U.S. for any purposes, including to vindicate whatever rights they may have had under the Constitution, which the administration did not acknowledge. Over a period of years, and we're still fighting that fight, the situation has shifted. Of course, the men do have rights, which we were able to establish, that those rights are being vindicated, and it is not turning out to be quite as aberrational as those of us thought. Looking at what we're seeing now, we at CCR see really four major themes that are happening that I think are relevant to this conversation. One is that we are seeing increased racialized narratives that are applied to particular communities. And in the Muslim and Arab context, of course, that racialized narratives is that community is a terroristic community. In the African American context, it's a criminalized community. In a immigrant context, it is both an illegal and a criminal narrative. The good news is that all of these groups are in good company in terms of being vilified by law enforcement structures. The bad news is that if you happen to be a black immigrant Muslim, then you get the trifecta. Second, we're seeing that there is also a narrative of internal threat, and this narrative of internal threat that Mike and Susan were talking about is key to what we're seeing as a quiet expansion of domestic law enforcement. And the third thing that we're seeing is that there's a rationalization of the law enforcement expansion through a balanced, sometimes nuanced, sometimes reasonable discourse, which gives people the feeling that in response to a terroristic threat, we need to increase our law enforcement response. These are, of course, false narratives for reasons that my colleagues up here have laid out, but there's a fourth piece as well, which is the repression of dissent. So every time that there is a criminalized narrative, every time that there are folks that want to speak out on what's happening to them or what's happening to connected communities, we also see that there is repression of dissent. What happens in the context of the post-9/11 context is that repression of dissent really speaks again to questions of criminality, terrorism, and hate. Just to give quick examples of how this plays out, in addition to Guantanamo, Susan was mentioning the New York City Police Department, and we represent Muslim communities who have been spied upon in the by the New York City Police Department in New Jersey. The ACLU represents Muslim people in New York City. We also have challenged communications management units, which are these prisons that were designed essentially and inhabited for a long time almost exclusively by Muslims. We also represented, right after the beginning of 9/11, rounding up of Muslims and Arabs in New York City. And why am I telling you all of this? Is because everything that we've talked about today pretty much has not required anybody to go to court to get permission to do this. It has not required any legislation. It is purely the discretion of the executive branch to move forward the violation of these rights. That's what we're seeing. It really speaks more like a mosque to prison pipeline than it really speaks to a national security initiative. So I wanted to put that into the perspective before I shift to Palestine. And I think what's important, the connection between what I'm talking about and just now in Palestine, is that the idea of criticizing a government's human rights abuse abroad gets equated with terrorism and terroristic activity at home by government entities, by corporations, by private actors. And so the CCR, we have a report that came out this year, which I would love for you to take a look at if you get a chance, and you can find it on our website. It's called The Palestine Exception to the First Amendment, and it details over an 18-month period all of the, particularly on campus, on college campuses around the country, the types of repression that's been happening. I want to talk about two parts of that repression, and one is academic freedom, and the other one is with respect to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, that Maya mentioned. I'll start off by saying when I was in college in the 1980s, what politicized me, what actually got me on this path to being a civil rights lawyer, was a connection to the moving against apartheid in South Africa. That was, on college campuses, one of the hot issues that politicized a lot of us. And at the time, of course, those of us who were protesting and asking our colleges to divest from companies that were supporting apartheid South Africa, we were called criminals, we were called terrorists. There was a vibrant debate, which is always good, but it was always in the context of criminalizing the people that are asking for the sanctions. And we're seeing that again today. In terms of academic freedom, there are a number of Israel-based or Israel-connected advocacy organizations that are actually actively launching public campaigns targeting those who criticize Israel. Now, there's no problem with having a campaign that speaks to one side of the issue versus the other. But what we see happening is, because of those campaigns, that governments, government-funded institutions very often will punish, censor, deny tenure to professors or fire professors just for issuing opinions that are critical of Israel. A university can side with free speech and resist those types of urges, but some universities don't, and a number of them don't, unfortunately. One quick example is that in 2014, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign terminated a Palestinian-American professor by the name of Stephen Sileda. He was in a tenured faculty position, and he was fired following pressure from donors who disagreed with his critique of Israel, and he was tweeting about the Israeli siege on Gaza in 2014. How do we know that it was donors that were doing this? Because we sued the university, and we got the university emails that looked at why the university fired him. And of course, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on the university from donors. This action of firing Mr. Salaita was universally condemned. There were no confidence votes from 16 departments within the campus. There were 5,000 academics that voted to censure the university. And in the context of that lawsuit, the judge found that his tweets implicated a central concern of the First Amendment. Why is this important to us? It's important because you may have read in the newspaper after the failed coup in Turkey that what is happening now is that academics are being rounded up and academics are being silenced. And in some ways, our academics and our academic institutions can be canaries in the coal mine in terms of how the country is treating these types of issues. So we have to, in no other place on earth, we have to be able to protect the First Amendment and academic freedom on our college campuses. That is the future of thought, literally the future of thought for our country. And we can't allow that thought to be limited based upon particular viewpoints. I want to take us just back very briefly to another time. We're going to go in a time machine, and we are now in 1880 in Ireland. Why are we in 1880 in Ireland? Because back then, there was a man that owned a tremendous number of farms, and he had these tenant farmers that were working on his farm. And there was a terrible crop in 1880, so he then, the tenant farmers asked the person who owned the farm, can you please lower our rents so that we can continue to live even though the crops were bad this year? The farmer said sure. He didn't lower it. He split the difference between what they asked for and what he wanted to give. The tenant said that's really not enough. So he refused to do anything else, and he ordered his agent of the farms to start evicting tenants from that land. The tenants of the land got together, and they said, rather than resist this violently, what we're going to do is we're going to completely isolate and shun this person. And there was a universal shunning of this man. I mean, they weren't even delivering this guy's mail. Nobody in the community would do business with him. And why am I telling you this? Because the name of that agent his last name was Boycott. And the concept of the boycott, going back even to 1880, is one that is essentially confrontational, which is good. It is essentially nonviolent, which is good, and it sends a collective message that the community will not support something that is unjust. And in the context of Israel and Israel human rights abuses, there's been, of course, a very, very vibrant BDS campaign that is growing. I want to talk a little bit about what that is and why and what it means. And just as an example, the American Studies Association entered into an academic boycott. And to be clear about that, what that means is that institution will have no formal collaboration with Israeli academic institutions. Following that action, a right-wing blogger for a blog called Legal Insurrection filed a complaint with the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of the ASA. Following that, an Israeli organization called Shirat Hadin filed a similar complaint against the Presbyterian Church for voting to divest from 3 companies that supply Israel with equipment that were used to subjugate Palestinians. Now we're seeing that there are a growing number of legislative bodies that are looking to limit free speech on this particular issue. There is actually legislation that's been happening in 2014 and 2015. Congress, the Congress here in the federal Congress, as well as a number of states have introduced legislation that would have universities receiving federal or state funding reduced if they provided any aid in support of a boycotting group. So New York, Florida, South Carolina, Maryland, and Illinois, and even the state of Pennsylvania has entertained that. What's the problem with this is that what they do is they seek to punish individuals, schools, organizations, or companies for participating in a lawful activity like boycotting or divestment. One of the latest things that's been happening here in New York, in my home state where I came from today, is our governor, Mario Cuomo, our Governor Cuomo, I'm old school, issued an executive order last month. So it's not even just the legislative process that was being debated in the state legislature, but he issued an executive order that essentially creates a blacklist of individuals and entities that boycott companies based in Israel or, quote, allied nations. So the problem here, of course, is that there's First Amendment activity that's being impinged, certainly. But I think the other narrative that's happening is that the underlying thought and the underlying reasons for this is because it feels to some people that because Israel is being criticized, that is somehow anti-Semitic, it is somehow anti-Jewish, when of course it is neither of those things. But embedded in the idea of that concept is that there is a criminalized, terrorized element that is pushing to destroy a nation state. And really, what that boycott is designed to do is not about destroying a nation state, but it's about allowing another nation state to thrive and survive in that context. So just to sum up, that we're in an era where our narratives are being criminalized. The processes by which people are fighting back are also being criminalized. The canary in the coal mines, I think, for us, in addition to the communities that are being policed, are academics and students who are trying to speak out on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. We're ending exactly on time in terms of the opportunity to open it up now for Q&A. I started by introducing you to the Arab American Institute, which was established in 1985. The organization that's hosting this event today is the Arab American Institute Foundation, which was established in 1998 specifically to do our 501c3 activities, which include educational programming. That's the capacity in which we are here today at the conventions, and we were at the Republican convention as well. And that is, we too obviously are a nonpartisan educational entity, and we're happy to be having this conversation here the way that we've had it at other parties as party conventions as well. So why don't we open it up to questions from the audience and continue the conversation. We'll start there in the corner, please. If you could kindly identify yourself, wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and then ask your question.
Hello, my name is Waqar Rahman. I have a question for the entire panel. Anyone can chime in. Is there a concern that the repression of the freedom of speech could itself become criminal in the eyes of the authorities? Are there cases where people have been arrested? I'm thinking of the case of Tariq Mahana back in 2012. Or is there any concern that it could be, speaking out itself could become criminal under some sort of anti-terrorism legislation?
Thank you.
Well, okay, I would start. Yes, that is a concern. Vince was describing the beginning of CCR. The ACLU is almost 100 years old and began right after World War I in 1920. And what the ACLU was reacting to, one of the chief reasons why the organizers got together, was that people were being criminally prosecuted for speaking out against World War I, against the draft, against the form of government. And the sedition laws, the espionage laws at the time were just terrible. So over the course of the 20th century, the ACLU was involved in almost every major Supreme Court case that developed the First Amendment in the way that we see it today, and in the way what we expect that courts will help us to enforce the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, and that you can make a First Amendment argument that the government cannot prosecute you. There are a lot of things I could talk about here, but we're limited by time. There's one Supreme Court case that very few people know about called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, which is a case where the Supreme Court said that the material support for terrorism statute, which was broadened by the Patriot Act to prohibit expert advice or assistance, could be used. It wasn't in that case, but it could be used to prosecute a group of peace activists, the Humanitarian Law Project, who were providing the expert advice to insurgent groups like the Kurds in Turkey and the Tamil Tigers, providing them with advice about how to avoid violence by using nonviolent dispute resolution methods. So it was crazy. It's like, you were supporting terrorism by teaching terrorists how not to be terrorists. The Supreme Court said that wouldn't violate the First Amendment. Now, the Humanitarian Law Project had just brought the lawsuit to say, is it possible that they could prosecute us for this? And the answer was, it is possible. in terms of the kind of cases that Vince was just talking about, the ACLU has 50 affiliates around the country, so it's hard for me to keep track of what everyone is doing. But I know there's at least one case in New Jersey where there was a student who was disciplined in school. I don't remember what form the discipline took, but she was disciplined for saying something, I think on her Facebook page, that was considered anti-Israel. And the ACLU of New Jersey represented her and said, you know, she has a First Amendment right. I don't know if there's been anything in Pennsylvania. Reggie says no. But, you know, these things happen around the country. But here's my concern. In the book that I was telling you about, I was talking about all the unintended consequences and the ways in which I think we've gone overboard with the dragnets and being afraid of, you know, you're not allowed to talk to a terrorist. Justice Sotomayor said in the argument of the Humanitarian Law Project case, she said, does this mean that you could be prosecuted for teaching a terrorist to play the harmonica? And the answer was yes. Elena Kagan at the time was the Solicitor General. She was asked, does this mean you could prosecute a lawyer for filing a brief on behalf of a terrorist? And her answer was yes. And so, you know, real threats to the First Amendment. The Obama administration has been a lot more restrained. In my book, I tell stories about, you know, prosecutions which really violated the First Amendment. A Saudi exchange student in Idaho who was prosecuted for material support of terrorism for posting comments on a chat room about all different views of Islam, including jihadist accounts of themselves, and he was prosecuted. And the judge did not dismiss that on the basis of the First Amendment. The stories recede when the Obama administration comes in. There have been problems. But my concern is that there are all these tools that the Patriot Act and President Bush's executive orders set up, which are still available for whoever the next president would happen to be. And one of our great disappointments was that Barack Obama, himself a constitutional law professor, didn't do enough to dismantle some of those laws. So there are some statutes in place that would allow such things to happen. And at every level, including things like school discipline, things keep bubbling up. And that's why I think we live in a very turbulent time, and I think you're absolutely right to say we have to keep an eye on our right to freedom of speech and to, you know, to make sure that we don't end up, you know, just kind of giving up by having too many exceptions, a right that has been so hard fought.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to add to that. Thank you, Susan. That the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project was a case, the Center for Constitutional Rights case, and it was exactly as Susan mentioned, argued by David Cole, who incidentally is going to be the next ACLU legal director. And that the important piece that I wanted to sort of flesh out is that it is in fact true that some of these cases are people testing, if we do this, will that be criminalized? And at some level, that's a privileged position that you have in terms of filing lawsuits. The vast majority of the way this thing works, it's not that the actual speech is criminal, it's that sometimes you get arrested first or detained first, and then you have to kind of litigate your way out of it. And so there's an interesting question there. I'm not so concerned that we're going to see legislation that says this particular type of speech is off limit, but I think that we'll be seeing much broader gray areas that are going to cause people a lot of concern.
And I think I would add to it, the end of 2008, right at the end of the Bush administration, the Attorney General Michael McCasey expanded the FBI's investigative authorities significantly. And they implemented in 2009 what they call a disruption strategy. So after an investigation is over and they haven't brought any charges, they feel they are empowered to conduct what they call disruption activities. And this might include overt interviews, so you can imagine how damaging it would be to you if the FBI went and interviewed your employer about whether or not you were a terrorist, your landlord about whether or not you were a terrorist, friends and neighbors. They can also implement informant stings, and that's what we're seeing a lot with these so-called ISIS cases, right, where this is just people who are talking online about their interest in traveling to a conflict zone. And rather than allow them to have those conversations and discuss what is a catastrophic humanitarian crisis and feel sympathy for that, the FBI targets those individuals with informants who try to push them along the line to material support, offering resources to travel, offering weapons, offering all kinds of things in an attempt to provoke the person into doing something that crosses this line toward material support that they can then make an arrest for. So, you know, to the extent CVE and these shared responsibility committees, which are these secretive volunteers who are going to be analyzing our speech for whether or not we're extremists, and our children are extremists, are setting you up for that, right? If you hear CVE proponents, they'll talk about CVE as an off-ramp, right? Rather than having the FBI use informants, let's get this person counseling, let an imam talk to them, let some person explain why their ideas are so bad, when really what it is a way for the people who are participating to identify people they think are at risk based on these specious indicators. Of course, if the main one is political grievances, that is going to be pushing anybody who is expressing their opposition to any government policy as a potential person to use these disruption tactics against.
If I could follow up on that, there's actually another kind of threat to our freedom of speech, which was not about your question, but I think what Mike was just saying is, to me, a very important connection between massive surveillance and freedom of speech. So, you know, anyone in the room who hasn't heard of Edward Snowden? Right. So, you know, my favorite cartoon from the New Yorker shows somebody sitting at a conference table in a room with a flag on the wall, and he's saying to his subordinates, "Get me everything on everybody." And it sometimes feels like that, right? So what there have recently been attempts to try to quantify the chilling effect that that's had on freedom of speech in many different ways. PEN, P-E-N, the organization of writers, journalists, authors, tried a survey of its own members this a year or two ago, and it's a fascinating study if you want to look at it. I don't have the percentages with me, but it was astonishing, you know, how many of the members said that they were censoring what they wrote on social media because they were afraid that the government might notice it and start, you know, pursuing, you know, they would end up on a no-fly list or, you know, a suspect or whatever. Censoring subjects that they were researching online or at libraries. And there was a lot of self-censorship going on. In 2015, Amnesty International did a set of polls that are quite similar, that also show an alarming degree of self-censorship. You were talking like up to 40% of the people surveyed would say either they had censored themselves or had seriously thought about it. So I think that the massive surveillance that was really supersized after 9/11 is really encroaching on the First Amendment. If we have time later, I know we want to get to other questions, but another thing I would love to talk to you about is the follow the money, or the financial surveillance, which has really been chilling attendance in mosques. It's a whole other issue.
Thank you so much. We've got a question there, and then we'll go there, and then up here.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much for your remarks. So we talked about how freedom of speech has been violated. I wonder if you guys can comment a little bit on how freedom of speech has been used maybe to, discriminate against groups or whatever, like we see in college campuses, where the people bring very racist or very inflammatory speakers and hide under this freedom of speech thing. So I really would be interested in your commentary on that.
Thank you.
Palestine. And then some other groups will protest that, but they won't just necessarily just show up. They will start writing letters to the administration, and the administration will start shutting down those other pieces. So, you know, one of those, the First Amendment works for all of us. It doesn't work equally well for all of us, and it doesn't always make us really happy. But I think the important piece is that it does require all of us to have very thick skins. It requires us to have as thick skins about other people's opinions as we want them to have about our opinions, so that those things get heard. That's how I would really characterize it.
You want to go
I
to
was-
the question?
Yeah, I was simply going to add briefly that part of the way to address that is also to identify the folks that are speaking. And there has been a great deal of research done on the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sort of network that's been created here. So the Center for American Progress published a very important report. Matt Duss is here, actually co-authored it, called Fear Inc. I would advise that you look at that and use that because it identifies the perpetrators of that hate speech. The Southern Poverty Law Center has now created a sort of database of those groups. So I think to Vince's point, you know, free speech means more free speech. It allows you to identify the speakers so the campus community can understand why they're there and what they're there to do. And I think that's a very constructive way in our society to kind of address that piece of it.
Do you want to go to another question?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
go
So we've got a gentleman there.
Hi. First, thank you for your participation on the panel. It's the work that you all do and your organizations do is incredibly critical, so I appreciate that. And I apologize for the semi-rhetorical nature of this question, but I really want to know what you think. So you mentioned earlier the impact that donors can have in a process like academics in chilling speech with the Salaita case and others. But I'm wondering what we do when the threat posed by donors is also at the highest levels of government. What I mean by that is, although I won't get into Mr. Trump and his views, which I don't think are constructive to anything, but even Secretary Clinton has been clear of her opposition to BDS, and she's made promises to donors like Mr. Saban and others that have been explicit, that she will do everything in her power to throttle this movement and to eliminate the support for it. So the question is, where's the check? The work that you all do is an amazingly important part of it, but I wonder, is it enough? What do we do when that sort of sentiment reaches so high?
Thank you.
That's a great question. My answer is that the work that we do on the people in the organizations here is never enough. It is something, and the answer is, what is the check on that type of activity? The answer is sitting in the audience. The answer is you. And by example, what I mean by that is that this is not the first time that, in the context of South Africa, Ronald Reagan was a fierce supporter of the apartheid regime, and he was dedicated to ensure that boycotts and divestment campaigns would not happen. I'm sure, although I don't know, that there were many, many, many deals and promises that were made to be able to support that, because of course at that time he was really focused on terrorism and communism, and he saw the ANC, the African National Congress, as a terrorist communist organization. So regardless of what the political lines that are drawn are, I think history has shown that with support of organizations, legal organizations and advocacy organizations, but I think frankly, because of the pushing of people of conscience who think deeply around these issues, that aren't deeply reactive to them, but really understand that there are human rights values that are at play, the honest answer, and there's no short-term fix to a complicated problem, is that people need to continue to be able to speak out on these issues and to pressure their governments, their institutions, their universities, their corporations, whatever entity is supporting a human rights violation, to not do that.
Thank you, Vince.
Yep, can I just agree with Vince that there's no short-term fix? I mean, the ACLU opposes campaign, we don't oppose limits on campaign contributions because people should not be buying candidates. But the thing is, the problem of money in politics is not that different from the problem of money in healthcare and education and housing. We live in an inequitable society where some people buy more things than others. And the idea that you can fix that inequity by having a law that says this money goes here, that money can't go there, I think we need a much longer term and much bigger fix.
And I think just very quickly that a big part of the problem is the lack of transparency, right?
Yeah.
The national security state has grown so significantly, and so much of our foreign policy is completely opaque to the average voter. And we need to address that through whistleblower reform, classification reform, and to focus on no secret law, right? There are certainly things that we need to keep secret for national security, but the law should never be one of them.
Including the disclosure of who the donors are.
Thank you for that. I apologize to you because the microphone's back there, but we'll come to you next, right after this one. Go ahead.
You talked earlier about the no-fly list. From personal experience, I believe there are different levels of the no-fly list, from not being able to fly, from added security, from being able to board flights and then being taken off. And you might ask, well, why would someone like me, be on a no-fly list? I served as the chaplain at Guantanamo Bay and was arrested after I objected to the abuses. So that's how I probably ended up on some of these lists. But my question is, coming back into the country on international travel, what rights do I have as a citizen at the border? I've been told you don't have any rights because you're not in America yet. I mean, like if the FBI came to my house and knocked on my door and said, could I talk to you? I could say no, right? But on the border, they ask me all kinds of questions like, who bought your plane ticket? Who did you go see? I get detained. What rights do I have on the border coming in, whether on land or through the airport?
Chaplain Yee, let me start by answering your question, which is more rights since what happened to you. If you look at the decision in the District of Oregon in Lateef versus, it was at the time Lateef versus Holder, the judge there agreed that constitutional rights apply. Citizens' constitutional rights do apply to travel back to the United States. So, we're working on that. There should be more rights than there are, but it was a very good start, the idea that, people do have, citizens have the right to return to the country. In terms of what kinds of questioning and searching can go on, that's, also a very complicated area. We have a bunch of cases about that too. So work in progress.
And one of the areas where your rights at the border are compromised are with searches and the seizure of electronic devices at the border and the downloading of electronic information from your devices. And we're seeing that particularly with journalists, where journalists coming back from overseas reporting are having their communications devices swept by Customs and Border officials. So it's a huge problem.
Let's go to our next question here. And just to give a time check here, we're 11 minutes out.
Good afternoon. My name is Ali Bel'eid Al-Maklani, coming from Michigan with the delegate to the DNC conventions. We nominate Hillary Clinton, of course, because we want President to build a bridge, not a wall. Civil right and civil liberty is very important. As an American, Arab Muslim, we believe in America. We believe in the Constitution. We are against the terrorists. But I don't know how long before America believe in us. You mentioned there is people, the fly zone, the checklist. Every time, some people who travel even 5-6 times, they stop them 6-7 hours. And even after he been or she been clear, they caught him again and stop him, same thing. So if we are here to work with the FBI, with Homeland Security, with the police since September 11, before we used to run away from them, but we want to be part of the solution, so we work together. So how long you think they going to keep it like this? Every time someone come, stop him. One time, a small story, one guy trying to bring his wife and his mother and his kids from Algeria. He's from Yemen. So he get killed over here in the United States. They want bring the family to say goodbye to him. As soon they come over here, they said they have a processing for a visa to come to the United States. No, she doesn't have that. She spent 1 night in the jail. I don't think this is human right, to treat the people like that. So for how long? And you, as a union, as involved on this kind of things, is there any way that we can do more? Or everything has happened, we accuse, and then sometimes we put the blame and trying to be nice for something we don't even do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali.
Well, let me say, I think that in some ways it's understandable that in the fall of 2001, our country overreacted to 9/11. There was a lot of emotional reaction. And the idea of the USA Patriot Act, which was enacted 6 or 7 weeks after the events of 9/11, was to lay out all these dragnets on the assumption that they knew what was happening. If there was, the terrorism was obviously being financed by people in Brooklyn mosques, so we had to investigate all the Muslim charities and all the mosques. And they just had these ideas that just turned out to be wrong. So in some ways, it's not that surprising that there were overreactions at the time and that they didn't yet know what was useful and what wasn't. But what I find so disappointing is that, 15 years later, we're still doing the same things. The ACLU has been making your argument. We filed a report called The New Normal. How long ago was that? Just, how long do we keep doing these things with no evidence that it works? All this massive surveillance that we're talking about, many, many more costs than people are aware of, including the chilling effect on speech and, people ending up having their lives disrupted, but much fewer benefits than anybody realizes. And I think the problem is, and that's what, Paul Ryan's comments on how awful that people wouldn't be able to possess a gun if they're on a ridiculous watch list. Well, why can't we get Congress to pay attention to the fact that people have had their lives affected? They've been detained and humiliated and banished from the country and prosecuted because of being on those same ridiculous watch lists. And I just think it's a tremendous lack of empathy, and I think most people, again, assume it's not going to be them, it's going to be somebody else. And I think that, Mike was saying there's not just one Arab or Muslim community. I think that institutes like yours, groups that can really get together and start exercising your political power and really starting to talk to elected representatives about why this just will not do. I think you're right, it has to change. It's been 15 years already, too long.
And I think, we just have to demand more accountability from our policymakers, particularly in the national security realm. Whenever something bad happens, the answer is always the same: do more and do it harder. Regardless of the fact that it's not actually working, doing more isn't going to help, it's going to make it worse. And, we have to start looking at these conflicts for what they are, as political conflicts, and we have to address them in the whole terms. If I had a magic button on this desk that I could push and every single member of ISIS dropped dead, we would still have a bloody civil war in Syria and a bloody civil war in Iraq going on, right? These are not conflicts that are only about extremism. These are political conflicts, and resolving the violence that's in those conflicts will go a long way towards reducing violence elsewhere, and also holding the media accountable, right? I mean, we talk about terrorism like it's a national security threat today, when with the exception of the 9/11 attacks, which were on a scale that had never been seen before. Since then, over the last 10 years, there has been far less terrorism in the United States, less Americans killed by terrorists in the United States than during the 1970s. And yet we didn't react to it the same way. Violent crime in this country is way down. This is one of the safest times in America, but if you listen to our security officials, they talk like this is the most dangerous time ever, and the media, of course, helps sensationalize these events to make it feel like it's a more dangerous time, and we need to hold them to account to make sure that we're addressing the problems that actually exist and not imaginary ones.
And I think part of the problem is that this whole security apparatus, the Department of Homeland Security that kind of got launched after 9/11, is self-perpetuating, because people have a self-interest in believing that they're doing valuable work and that their department should be refunded. And the government sort of chugs along this tremendous inertia, and Congress has never looked at some of the things that were embedded in the law that could be used more than they have been used recently, that I think just push us in the wrong direction. They have never looked at whether those things are effective, cost-effective, counterproductive, because there's just so much self-interest and inertia in the government.
So I'm going to have Vince make a comment, and I think we have time for 2 more questions, and I know there's one there and one there.
Thank you very much for your question, and I think it's a meta question that you asked. I wanted to start off specifically. I am not a fan of cooperating with the FBI on all accounts for 2 reasons. One reason is because of the experience of African American communities over the years with a different FBI, but the FBI nonetheless, with respect to COINTELPRO and things like that. Another reason why I'm not a fan is because of an experience that we litigated recently where there were 4 Muslim men based in New York. And the 4 Muslim men were approached by FBI agents, and they were asked to spy on their communities and their mosques, give information. The men refused to do it. They didn't want to do that. So as a result, the FBI put them on the no-fly list. So getting back to Susan's question, or Susan's framing of that you never know the reasons why you end up on that list, and you certainly don't know how to get off. In this particular case, we have a concentrated reason as to why that happened. We filed the lawsuit. The FBI took them off. They were taken off the watch list. It's probably the best way to put it. But I think it raises that a larger question, and the question about how long, I think, is a fantastic question. And I want to just get a little civil rightsy on the civil liberties tip here. African American folks have been asking that question for a very long time. Women have been asking that question for a very long time. Everybody's been asking that question. It is a process, it is a democratic process that happens. That's never a good enough answer when people are suffering, ever. But that is the question. And the debate, which is true in all communities, is about, is it an inside game that's gonna get us there? Is it an outside game that's gonna get us there? Is it a combination of both? History shows us that it is always a combination of both. I just wanna leave you with something that Harry Belafonte, the great Harry Belafonte, said to me when I was lucky enough to meet with him. He said, you know, Vince, we thought back in the 1960s, Harry Belafonte is a wonderful singer and activist from the civil rights era, African-American man. He said, back in the 60s, we thought if we just had access to power, if we could just get in the door, that materially conditions would be getting better for African-Americans. And no one would dispute that conditions have gotten better for African-Americans. We have an African-American president, et cetera, et cetera. However, there are people that are protesting in the streets right now because of Black Lives Matter. So the question really isn't sort of how long. The question is, what are we going to continue to do to be able to push, to live in dignity in the way that we should, have our communities respected, get the government off of our back, treat us the same way that they treat everybody else, and then treat everybody else in a way that makes sense.
Thank you for that, Vince. Indeed. We have one there, and then one here, and I'm going to ask you to be very brief because I don't want to go over. We have to switch for the next panel, please.
Well, I have an FBI file from the late 60s, and it seemed that a lot of that surveillance was discredited by the Church Committee report and so on, and yet I'm wondering if you can really distinguish it from what you're describing, and what is the accepted rationale for, as they did in my case, going around and checking on my bank account and blah, blah, blah. They didn't have the technological capability that they do now, but has anything really changed? Is there difference legally?
I'll start with that because the chief counsel at the Brennan Center where I work is Fritz Schwartz, who is the chief counsel to the Church Committee, and I've had the good fortune to work with him and a number of other former staff and members of the Church Committee, and we put together a symposium last year, around this time last year, that's on our website. So if you go to the Brennan Center and search for, we did a report strengthening intelligence oversight because they recognize those problems are now, again, in the forefront. I think part of it is the way the government frames it, right? Al-Qaeda was a new threat. The world had never seen anything like this before. It's brand new, so that means we can't learn anything from history. We can forget all that, and we have to apply a very new standard, new techniques, and that's what opened the door to going down the very dark path that we've gone down in a lot of these issues. But even then, right, I mean, you would think 15 years out, we would, that we're fighting a war on terror we started 15 years ago, and we're fighting a primary antagonist who didn't exist when it started and is actually in bloody conflict with the original Al-Qaeda. Seems a little, should beg some questions about what we're doing. But again, they keep talking about ISIS as some new thing. This is a new thing. They have new techniques. They have new technology. Well, plumbers have new technology too, right? Everybody has access to the new technology, but the conflict is no different than every other conflict before it, and we have to, again, hold our policymakers to what is actually happening and not let them create imaginary causes for these conflicts, because we're not going to be able to address the conflict until we start understanding them better than just this is a problem of extremism.
If I can give you a constitutional law professor answer for a minute, we've been talking a lot about the First Amendment, but there's also the Fourth Amendment, which is supposed to protect us against unreasonable searches and seizures. You ask what's been different since COINTELPRO. It's gotten worse because the government can find out a whole lot more about us through all the technology, all the changes. And we can blame the Supreme Court for this one, because the Supreme Court has a ridiculous interpretation of the Fourth Amendment that says you are not entitled to privacy of any records that you share with a third party. Because, hey, what do you expect? You tell somebody else, they might tell the government. Therefore, the government can force them to give the government your records. It's a stupid theory. The Supreme Court is beginning to worry about it a little bit in terms of what does your internet service provider know about you? Oh, come on. But Congress has done nothing about electronic privacy since 1986, and it's gotten worse.
I would, having said that we're completely out of time, I would add to that point, because I really feel like we tried to cover a lot in today's conversation, but one of the deficits in the discussion we've had really has been how much technology has impacted the surveillance piece of this, and we could spend another hour and a half specifically on that point. I promised one last question, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, and we're going to wrap up and get ready to switch over.
I'll try to be quick. I've been coordinating the struggle against the anti-boycott legislation in California, and two real quick questions about that. One is, Vincent, you mentioned that in the 80s there was a lot of opposition, governmental opposition to the boycott and divestment efforts, but was there really the kind of legislation back then to try to stifle the speech of the people who were boycotting and divesting on their own? And the second question is, we've now written 7 legal memos as they continue to rewrite this bill to try to pretend it's constitutional. And a very weird twist in the latest one is a criminalization aspect. I'd like your comment on that. They now require anybody who wants to contract with or receive funding from the state of California to certify under penalty of perjury that they are not adopting a policy against another country, including but not limited to Israel, it says, as a pretext for discrimination. I mean, it's really weird and bizarre, but this is like an element of criminalization that they're entering into at a new form of perjury. And I'm just curious to your comments on that. Thanks.
Thanks for your question.
I did do some research about the 1980s, and I do recall that there was legislation that was drafted. I don't think I'm not clear that anything was actually passed in any of the in Congress or in any of the state legislatures. I don't know for 100%. I suspect that it did happen. The other thing with respect to the criminalization piece, that it's deeply troubling, and just based on what you were saying, seems so incredibly overbroad. How can anybody certify that you're not adopting a policy with respect to any of unnamed countries with respect to discrimination? There are so many different layers that are on top of this. What it essentially is doing, it's creating a risk factor for people to exercise their public speech, and almost risk factors in ways that people can't really get their heads around. I'm not even sure how I would possibly be able to demonstrate to any degree of certainty that I'm moving in a direction that won't be moved in some other ways by other people. And at some levels, that's beside the point. The point, of course, of the First Amendment is not to guarantee that everyone will be safe and that all will be fine. The point of the First Amendment is to allow you to be able to speak your mind clearly. And you can even speak in a discriminatory fashion if that's what you choose to do, not advisable. Last thing I would say is on the discrimination piece is that, again, we're getting back to the sort of the hate narrative and the criminalization narrative that there is, and I want to just say this again, that it is possible to criticize a government without discriminating against its people. It is possible to criticize a government without discriminating against any particular religion within that country. It's possible to criticize a government for a whole range of things, and in fact, criticizing the government is a large part of what we do here and why we're here. So keeping those things separate and apart in the minds of rational thinking people, regardless of how you feel about the particular issue, is deeply important.
Thank you so much, Vincent, and Mike, and Susan.
Do you want a last comment, or I'm sorry? Do you want a last comment from each of us?
Please.
Okay, so broadening this out, and the ACLU has been defending unpopular speech since 1920, and I just thought you would be interested to know that we had to litigate, the ACLU of Ohio had to litigate to have demonstrations permissible and possible at the convention in Cleveland. And I thought you might be interested to know that the lead plaintiff, in addition to Ohio Homelessness Group, in that lawsuit was Citizens for Trump. So, we defend anybody's speech. What I wanted to say, Maya was saying there's so much we haven't had time to cover. So the ACLU website has a ton of reports, all the things about surveillance and technology. Many of you would be very interested too, I think, in looking at a report we issued in 2009 called Blocking Faith Freezing Charity, which was about the war on the Muslim charities, something that a lot of people don't know about. And the implications for freedom of religion were just enormous. The final thing I want to say is that I had brought along a copy of my book, which I described to you, so in case I wanted to read a quote, which I didn't. But instead of my carrying it home, I am happy to give it as a gift to the first person who asks me. Okay, that was you. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. I would, two things very quickly. The first is as we wrap up, I'm really sort of fixated on Ali's question when you talked about we believe in America and will America believe in us. And I've been thinking about that as we sat here to have this conversation. There is no question that we value and uphold the rights that are afforded us in this country as natural-born citizens, as immigrants, and the ability to have this conversation here at the National Constitution Center is not one that's missed on me. I'm so appreciative that we're all here to do that. And then I thought about what you said, Vince, which was that we play the inside game and the outside game, right? So I'm grateful for the Arab Americans. I just want to share this with you that are here in their capacity as members of Congress, that are here in their capacities as party chairs, their floor whips on the floor. We are both doing what we're doing here today with our partners who have played inside games at the National Security Council meetings at the White House, as well as partners who are literally demonstrating outside as well. And I think it's an important piece of the way we're having this conversation. I'm grateful for that. We're going to take a quick break and then pivot to a Palestine-focused conversation. For those of you who want to stay, we have our friends here from Americans for Peace Now, Deborah DeLee. Peter Barnard is here. Sam Bahor is already here from Palestine, and Dr. Jim Zogby, who's the president of the Institute, will lead that. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you all. Thank you. That was awesome. That was fantastic. We covered a lot.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm so
Time is